Part 4. The Final Confrontation and Resolution. Chapter 31. The Storm of Destiny. The first warning came subtly, almost deceptively, a tremor in the air that thrummed low and deep, barely noticeable at first, like the murmur of distant thunder. Seb stilled, his body instinctively reacting before his mind could place the sensation. The ground beneath his boots seemed to pulse, as though the very stones were alive and recoiling from something approaching. It wasn't just physical, it reached into him, rattling the core of his being like a whisper of doom carried on the wind. The ocean responded next. Its surface, usually calm and rhythmic in its endless push and pull, twisted into strange, uneasy ripples. The tide shifted unnaturally, drawing back not as part of the moon's command but as if recoiling in dread. Seb's eyes scanned the dark water, now laced with flickers of unnatural light deep below, as if something immense stirred beneath. The air grew sharper, colder, the wind no longer playful but slicing, twisting like a creature agitated and alert. Alaric stood motionless at the edge of the cliff, framed by the moonlight like a statue carved from shadow and memory. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles gleamed white. His shoulders were tense, his frame coiled like a spring. Seb's eyes were drawn to his face, to the hard set of his jaw and the flickering gleam in his dark eyes. Light reflecting from the moon, yes, but also something older, something Seb had only glimpsed once before, in the heat of battle when Alaric's true strength had surfaced. There was a stillness to him now, a terrible quiet that screamed of danger held at bay. Seb felt the hairs rise along his arms, not just from the chill of the wind but from the unmistakable sense that something ancient and powerful was on its way. Alaric wasn't just staring at the sea, he was sensing it, listening to something far beyond Seb's perception. The connection between the siren and the ocean ran deep, and right now, it was sounding an alarm. Seb hesitated, then stepped closer, the crunch of his boots loud against the silence. "Alaric?" he said, low and uncertain, his voice carrying across the brittle air. There was a tension in his chest he couldn't name, a pressure that tightened with every heartbeat. Something was wrong, more wrong than usual. Alaric didn't move at first. He stood rigid, his breathing shallow, as if he were weighing something immeasurable, something no one else could see. The pause stretched long, and Seb almost repeated his name, but then Alaric's head turned slowly. When his eyes met Seb's, they were filled with something that made his stomach drop, a haunted, hollow intensity that sent a chill down Seb's spine. There was fear in those eyes, but not for himself. It was the fear of someone who understood too much, who knew what was coming and couldn't stop it. Seb had seen Alaric wounded, had seen him cornered and furious, but never like this. This was deeper, colder. Alaric looked as if he were already bracing for a blow that hadn't yet landed but would leave devastation in its wake. Seb stepped forward and reached out, his hand finding Alaric's arm. "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's coming?" He could feel the tension radiating off Alaric's body like heat from a flame, every muscle tight, every breath measured. Whatever this was, it was worse than anything they had faced before. Alaric finally spoke, his voice a murmur barely louder than the wind. "Something is waking," he said, the words heavy with dread. "Something older than the council, older than my people's memory. I thought it was bound forever beneath the sea. But it's stirring now." He turned fully then, facing Seb with raw honesty in his eyes. "And it knows we're here." "The prophecy," Alaric said again, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking it aloud made it more real. His eyes didn't leave the horizon, where dark clouds had begun to swirl in the distance, growing blacker and thicker with each passing second. "It's coming. The storm. The one we've been trying to prevent. It's here." His words hung between them, heavy with centuries of fear and expectation, as if the very sea itself was listening. Seb's heart clenched. A cold ripple spread down his spine, not from the rising wind, but from the weight of Alaric's tone, so certain, so resigned. "What do you mean, the storm? The one in the prophecy?" he asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. He had heard rumors, fragments of old stories passed down like ghost tales among fishermen and old sailors, but he never let himself believe them. Alaric finally turned to face him, his jaw clenched, eyes dark with turmoil. Yes, he said firmly. The storm isn't just wind and waves. It's the unraveling of everything, of the ocean's rhythms, of the sky's order, of the ground's strength. The end of both our worlds, human and siren alike. The balance we depend on is collapsing, and if we can't stop it— His voice faltered for a heartbeat before he forced it back. Then everything we know will drown beneath it. Seb's thoughts tumbled like waves during a tempest. The prophecy. It had always sounded like a myth. A tale to scare young sirens and inspire reckless heroes. He remembered hearing it in passing, in old journals and in the mutterings of wary elders. When the sea howls and the sky turns black, the bond between the worlds shall break, and silence shall swallow all. Now, with the wind roaring louder by the minute and the skies above swirling into chaos, Seb realized it wasn't just legend, it was a warning. He took a breath, steadying himself as he looked at Alaric. There has to be something we can do. Something in the prophecy, some way to stop it. His voice was desperate, searching. He couldn't believe they had come so far, survived so much, only to be swept away by a force no one truly understood. Not when they still had each other. Alaric shook his head slowly. The prophecy never spoke of how to stop it. Only that two souls, one of land, one of sea, would stand at the edge of the world when the end came. He hesitated, then added quietly, I think it meant us. The wind whipped around them now, howling like a beast loosed from its cage. I didn't want to believe it. I thought we could change things, escape the cycle. But maybe we were always meant to face it. Seb's jaw tightened, defiant even as dread pulled in his chest. Then we'll face it. Together. He stepped closer, gripping Alaric's arm. I don't care what some ancient words say. We've broken curses before. We've survived betrayal, war, and loss. Whatever this storm is, we'll fight it. Alaric's expression softened, his gaze sweeping over Seb with a mixture of sorrow and love. You still believe we can change fate? He murmured, voice rough. That's why I love you. He turned his gaze back toward the ocean, where the waves now crashed higher, wild and aimless. But fate doesn't care about love. This storm, it's not just nature. It's the consequence of centuries of imbalance, of blood spilled and bonds broken. We may not be able to win this. Seb stepped forward until their shoulders touched, their warmth shielding them from the cold breath of the storm. Maybe we can't win, he said. But we can stand our ground. If this really is the end, then we won't face it apart. The sky above them cracked with distant thunder, the storm drawing closer, but Seb didn't flinch. Not when Alaric was beside him. Not when love, however fragile, still burned bright against the coming dark. How do we stop it? Seb asked, his voice filled with determination that cut through the howling wind around them. The sky had darkened even further, the storm creeping closer with terrifying speed. He was used to fighting, to taking on impossible odds, but this was different. This wasn't some enemy to outwit or a battlefield to win. This was the end of everything he knew. And if there was any way to stop it, he needed to know. Alaric's eyes flickered for a brief moment, like a shadow passing across the surface of calm water. He didn't immediately answer, his gaze far away, lost in thoughts Seb could only guess at. There was something there, something painful, something raw, that Seb didn't fully understand. When Alaric spoke again, his voice was steady, but the weight of the words carried the gravity of a prophecy too old, too unforgiving. We have to confront the heart of the storm, Alaric said, his voice low, almost reverent. Only those who are bound by the prophecy, the ones marked by the tides, can face it directly. His eyes met Seb's, and for the briefest of moments, Seb saw a flicker of doubt in Alaric's gaze. But the cost? Seb's chest tightened, the words hanging in the air like a thick fog. The cost? He repeated, his voice edged with urgency. What cost, Alaric? What are we talking about here? He needed to understand. They didn't have time for hesitation or fear. If they were to face the storm, they had to know what they were up against, no matter how dire. Alaric's eyes shifted away from Seb's, his jaw tightening as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. When he spoke again, his words were barely above a whisper, like they were stolen from him by forces far greater than they could comprehend. To stop the storm, to end the destruction. His voice trailed off, and for a long moment, he seemed to gather his strength before continuing. One of us must sacrifice everything. The prophecy says that the one bound to the human world must sever their connection to it, and the one bound to the sea must surrender their immortality. Alaric's voice broke slightly, and Seb could see the deep pain etched in every line of his face. The storm can only be quelled by a sacrifice so great that neither world will ever be the same again. Seb's heart slammed in his chest, and for a brief, sickening moment, he thought he might collapse under the weight of those words. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind spun with disbelief, trying to wrap itself around the impossible choice that lay before them. One of us, he repeated, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. He wanted to say it wasn't possible, that there had to be another way, but the way Alaric said it, the resigned tone, the finality in his eyes, told him everything. There was no other way. They were bound by this fate. But I don't understand, Seb said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain steady. If we're both bound to this prophecy, why does one of us have to make the ultimate sacrifice? Why can't we both survive this? His mind raced, thoughts colliding in an attempt to make sense of what Alaric had said. There had to be some loophole, some hidden meaning. But deep down, he already knew the answer. Alaric turned to face him fully, his expression darker than Seb had ever seen it. Because that's how it has to be, Alaric replied, his voice tight with emotion. The one who is tied to the human world, he gestured to Seb, must leave it behind, sever all ties, or else the storm will never be stopped. The one bound to the sea, Alaric's hand rested over his heart, must surrender their immortality, their very nature, or the ocean itself will remain unbalanced. Neither world can continue as it was. He paused, his eyes meeting Seb's with an intensity that made Seb's stomach churn. This is how it's always been. The prophecy doesn't leave room for exceptions. Seb clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the wave of panic threatening to drown him. But you're asking for everything, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. You're asking me to give up everything. My life, my place among humans, and you. His voice cracked, and he had to swallow the lump in his throat. You're asking yourself to give up immortality, the sea, everything that makes you who you are. Alaric's face softened for a moment, his gaze filled with sorrow. I know, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I know the cost. But it's the only way. If we don't do this, the storm won't just destroy us, it will destroy everything. Both of our worlds will be swallowed whole, and nothing will remain. We'll be gone, forgotten, just like everything else that came before. Seb wanted to scream, to shout at the unfairness of it all. But the words wouldn't come. He felt a sense of finality settle over him, cold and unyielding. This was it. This was the choice they had to make. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much it terrified him, Seb knew that neither of them could run from it. The storm was here, and they would face it, whatever the cost. The realization hit Seb like a punch to the gut. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The words seemed to hang in the air like a dense fog, pressing down on him with an unbearable weight. You mean? His voice faltered as he tried to wrap his mind around what Alaric had just revealed. One of us has to die. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a horrible truth that seemed to choke the air from his lungs, squeezing the life from him with each passing second. The very thought of it, of losing Alaric, or of having to give up everything he had ever known, was incomprehensible. Alaric's gaze fell, his eyes clouded with pain and guilt, and he nodded solemnly. There was no bravado in his expression, no attempt to soften the truth. He just looked, exhausted. Yes, he said, his voice a low whisper, carrying the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. But it's not just death. It's giving up everything we are, everything we fought for. His eyes lifted to meet Seb's, but there was no comfort in them, only the harsh reality of what was coming. It's the price of preventing the end of both our worlds. And even then, it might not be enough. His words cut deeper than any blade, leaving Seb reeling with the enormity of the sacrifice Alaric was describing. Seb's mind spun, trying desperately to comprehend the gravity of what Alaric was saying. This wasn't just about fighting for survival anymore. This was something far darker, something that threatened to unravel everything they had worked for. He couldn't even begin to understand what it would mean to give up everything. His humanity, his life, the love they had fought so hard to preserve. And for what? To save a world that seemed on the brink of collapse? To stop a storm that was so much more than just a natural disaster? The weight of it all threatened to crush him, but it was the sense of finality that overwhelmed him most. It wasn't just a battle, it was a choice neither of them could escape. The wind suddenly howled, fierce and unrelenting, as if it were reacting to the very conversation they were having. It ripped through the air, tugging at their clothes and pulling at their hair with a force that seemed almost alive. The storm wasn't just coming, it was already here, encroaching upon them with each passing moment. The once calm sea now churned ominously, the waves rising in sync with the growing tension in the air. Seb felt the pull of something ancient, something deep within the ocean itself, rising up against them, as if the very depths of the world were awakening and calling them to face what was inevitable. Alaric stood motionless at the edge of the cliff, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his features set in a mask of concentration. Seb could feel the weight of his silence, the way Alaric seemed to be gathering every ounce of his strength for something that was yet to come. But as the wind battered them, Seb noticed the way Alaric's shoulders were stiff, how his hands clenched at his sides as if fighting an invisible force. He wasn't just facing a storm, he was facing the storm, the one that had been foretold, the one that would destroy everything unless a sacrifice was made. A chill ran through Seb, not from the wind, but from the realization that this wasn't just some inevitable battle. This wasn't just the end of a war or a confrontation between enemies, it was the end of all things. And Alaric had known this moment was coming. He had known that they would reach this crossroads, where one of them would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. It wasn't just about stopping the storm, it was about ensuring that there would even be a world left to fight for. And no matter how much Seb wanted to deny it, he knew that the storm was inevitable, that the prophecy was as real as the very earth beneath their feet. The air around them seemed to shift, becoming heavier with each passing second. The wind picked up, the sky darkening even further, as if the world itself was preparing for the storm's arrival. Seb's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of the choices before them, but the more he thought, the more he realized that there were no good answers. There was no escape. The storm was coming, and only one of them could survive it. The very thought of losing Alaric made his chest tighten, a pain so deep it felt like it was carving him from the inside out. He couldn't even fathom the idea of living in a world without him. Alaric's face remained unreadable, his eyes reflecting the turmoil in the sky. The tension between them grew, thick and suffocating, as Seb struggled to find the words that might change things, to offer an alternative, anything that might allow them to survive this without losing so much. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no way out. No loophole. No escape. The storm, the prophecy, the sacrifice, they were all bound together in a way that couldn't be undone. Alaric! Seb's voice was barely a whisper, a tremor in it that betrayed the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Is there really no other way? He asked, his eyes searching Alaric's for any trace of hope, any sign that there might be something they hadn't thought of, some way to fight this and win without paying such a high price. But Alaric didn't answer, his gaze still fixed on the storm as it continued to brew in the distance. In that silence, Seb realized that the answer had already been given. The storm was inevitable, and the price was already set. The sea roared in the distance, the wind howling louder now, as if in agreement with the storm's coming fury. Seb felt the pull of it, the weight of the prophecy, the knowledge that there was no turning back. The storm would come, and when it did, they would either survive it together, or not at all. The bond between them, so strong and so fragile, was now all that stood between them and the end of everything. But no matter how hard Seb fought against it, He knew there was no changing what was about to happen. "The storm is coming," Alaric said, his voice strained, carrying the weight of urgency. His eyes flickered towards the horizon, where dark clouds had begun to gather, swirling ominously in the distance. "We don't have much time. It's already gathering strength, and if we don't act now, it will tear both our worlds apart." His words hung heavy in the air, each syllable like a hammer strike against Seb's chest. The gravity of the situation had finally settled in. This was not a fight against a mere weather event. This was the end of everything, a reckoning of the forces that governed both their worlds. The storm was not just a storm. It was the embodiment of destruction itself, a force of nature as old as the ocean's deepest tides. Seb's heart raced, his breath quickening as he absorbed Alaric's words. He had never felt the true power of the ocean in this way, its fury, its wrath, its unforgiving nature. The ocean, which had always been a vast and mysterious force to him, now felt alive, as though it were a beast ready to pounce. The air around them was charged with energy, thick with the impending violence of the storm. Seb's mind struggled to grasp the enormity of it, but one thing was clear: this was not just another battle. This was something far more primal, something that would test the very fabric of their existence. And yet, standing beside Alaric, feeling the depth of his connection to the sea, Seb knew this was no ordinary storm. It was a manifestation of their fates, the culmination of everything that had led them here. The ocean itself was calling, demanding something from them, something they weren't yet ready to face. "We'll stop it," Seb said firmly, his voice unwavering despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. He turned to face Alaric, the determination in his eyes matching the strength of his words. "Whatever it takes. We'll stop it together." He knew the gravity of what he was saying, but in that moment, with Alaric standing at his side, Seb couldn't bring himself to doubt. They had come this far. They had fought against impossible odds, and they had survived. Whatever this storm was, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together. The bond they shared, forged through trials and sacrifices, would be their strength. No matter the cost, Seb was ready to fight. Alaric looked at him, his gaze softening for a brief moment. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost vulnerable, as if he had wanted to believe that what Seb said could be true. But the softness was fleeting, quickly replaced by the hard resolve that had kept him alive for centuries. "You don't understand, Seb," he said, his voice quieter now, more resigned. "The storm is just a symbol. The real battle lies within us, within the choices we make now. And there's no way to know what the consequences will be." His words were like a cold splash of water, a reminder that no matter how much they wanted to fight, they were still at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. Seb frowned, the weight of Alaric's words sinking in. The storm was a symbol? A representation of something deeper, something more profound. His mind raced to connect the dots. What did Alaric mean by that? If the storm was just a precursor, a warning of something far worse to come, then what were they really up against? The thought that this wasn't just about the ocean's fury, but about the choices they had made, and the ones they were about to make, sent a shiver down Seb's spine. The stakes were higher than he had realized. This was not just a physical battle. It was a fight for their very souls, for the future of both the human and siren worlds. The storm raged in the distance, its clouds darkening the sky, and Seb felt the tension in the air grow thicker. The wind whipped around them, carrying with it the salty tang of the ocean, now mixed with the sharpness of something far more dangerous. Alaric had spoken the truth. This wasn't just about surviving the storm. This was about surviving what it represented, the breaking point, the moment when everything would change. The ocean, once a vast and endless expanse, was now closing in on them, becoming a force of nature they could not control. And the power that had once seemed so wondrous now felt like a curse, a reminder of the devastation it could bring. "Alaric, what are we supposed to do?" Seb asked, his voice tight with frustration and fear. The uncertainty that hung between them was unbearable. Alaric had said they could stop the storm, but now Seb understood that it wasn't just about confronting the tempest, it was about confronting their own fears, their own choices. And how could they possibly know the consequences of those choices before it was too late? How could they navigate a path that seemed to lead only to destruction, no matter what direction they took? Alaric's face hardened once more, his expression resolute, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. A warning, perhaps, or maybe a flicker of regret. "We do what we must," he said, his voice calm but heavy with the burden of knowing what was at stake. "We make the choice. We stand against the storm, and we do everything we can to protect the worlds we love. But know this, Seb, whatever happens, we can't turn back. There's no undoing what's coming." His words were like a final decree, a reminder that once the storm broke, there would be no more choices to make, no more chances to rewrite their fate. Seb's chest tightened as he processed the weight of Alaric's words. He had always believed that they could find a way to fight and win, that there was always a solution, always a way out. But now, standing on the precipice of the unknown, Seb realized how little they truly understood about what was coming. The storm wasn't just a physical event, it was a reckoning, a culmination of their past decisions and the forces beyond their control. The weight of that knowledge settled heavily on Seb's shoulders, and for the first time, he felt the true magnitude of what they were facing. There was no more pretending, no more hoping it would all work out. The storm was coming, and with it, the final test of their will. The sky seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns, as if responding to the deep, ancient energy that hummed beneath their feet. Alaric stood tall, the wind buffeting him, his expression unreadable, as if he were bracing himself for the inevitable. Seb could see the toll it had already taken on him, the weariness in his eyes, the strain of knowing that this was a battle either of them could win without sacrifice. The storm was no longer just a force of nature, it was a harbinger of something far darker, something that would either break them or bind them together in a way they hadn't anticipated. And as the storm began to take shape before them, Seb knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Seb reached out, his fingers brushing gently against Alaric's arm, grounding himself in the simple touch. The contact was a lifeline, a tether in the chaos that was swirling around them. He could feel the heat of Alaric's skin through his clothes, the pulse of life beneath the surface, and it reminded him, with a painful clarity, of everything he stood to lose. "I don't care about the consequences," Seb said, his voice firm but raw, the emotion thick in his chest. "I care about us, about saving both our worlds. We're in this together, and we'll figure it out. We have to." His words echoed in the wind, but they felt like a promise. A promise to stand by Alaric, no matter the cost. There was no other way. They were bound by something deeper than fear, something stronger than destiny itself. Alaric hesitated, his gaze flickering to the horizon where the storm was now an undeniable force, darkening the sky with its fury. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the weight of the storm had reached into Alaric's very soul, pulling at him with an insistent force. Then, with a look of deep sorrow, his shoulders sagged, and he nodded, his eyes lowering. "I just don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice breaking with vulnerability. The words hit Seb like a physical blow. Alaric had always been so sure, so steadfast, but in this moment, he was as fragile as Seb had ever seen him. The fear in Alaric's voice wasn't just about the storm. It was about the unknown, about the possibility that they might not make it through this together. And that fear, raw and unguarded, pierced Seb's heart. Seb's chest tightened painfully at the depth of Alaric's words. The reality of the situation had always been there, hanging in the air like a storm cloud, but hearing Alaric's fear laid bare made it all too real. Without another thought, Seb pulled Alaric into a fierce embrace, his arms wrapping tightly around him as if to shield him from the weight of everything closing in. The world could have crumbled around them in that moment, and Seb wouldn't have cared. The storm raged, its winds howling and threatening to tear the cliffside apart, but in that single moment of contact, everything else faded into the background. The battle, the prophecy, the storm, it all seemed distant, insignificant, compared to the warmth and solidity of Alaric in his arms. Nothing mattered except the man in his arms, the bond they shared, and the future they still had a chance to fight for. That was all Seb needed to hold on to. The wind howled fiercely, tugging at their clothes, but Seb held on, refusing to let go. Alaric's form was steady, despite the storm's force, and Seb drew strength from the way the siren's body pressed against his, the heartbeat that matched his own. But even in the midst of this moment of connection, Seb knew that this wasn't the end. The storm, the culmination of everything they had feared, was still out there, gathering power and waiting to engulf them. It was a reminder of everything they stood to lose. Still, he held on tighter, willing to fight with everything in him to make sure that the future they dreamed of was more than just a fleeting hope. They had to win. There was no other choice. As they stood together on the edge of the cliff, the sky above them darkening with the weight of impending destruction, Seb could feel the weight of destiny bearing down on them. The storm was a physical presence, an almost tangible force of nature that was closing in with every passing moment. But more than that, it was the embodiment of everything they had fought for, and everything they had yet to sacrifice. In its raging heart, the storm held the power to tear at the fabric of everything they had known. The balance between the human world and the sea was hanging by a thread, and the storm was the final test. Seb's heart pounded in his chest as he thought of the choices ahead, the ones that would shape not just their future, but the fate of their worlds. The wind picked up again, whipping through their hair and tugging at their clothes, but neither Seb nor Alaric flinched. They stood as one, facing the storm that was coming to claim them. Every second felt like an eternity, each breath a countdown to the inevitable confrontation with destiny. Seb's thoughts raced. How could they stop it? How could they win when the odds seemed so insurmountable? The storm was not just a force of nature, it was a storm of destiny, one that would tear at the fabric of everything they had known. And Seb knew, in his bones, that they had no choice but to face it. They had no choice but to fight, even when the path forward was obscured by the fear of what might be lost. In that moment, Seb realized the full weight of what they were facing. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for their very existence, for the love they had fought so hard to preserve. The prophecy, the storm, the sacrifices, they were all intertwined in a way that Seb couldn't fully understand. But what he did understand was the one thing that had kept him going all this time: Alaric. No matter what happened, no matter what choices they had to make, Seb would never give up on him. He had already lost too much to let go now. His resolve hardened, and he turned his focus back to the task at hand. He would protect Alaric, and he would protect both their worlds, no matter the cost. Alaric's hand found Seb's, their fingers locking together in a simple gesture that spoke volumes. In that brief touch, Seb felt the strength of their connection, the bond that had withstood countless challenges. It was unspoken but understood. This was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything they had built, for everything they loved. Alaric's grip tightened, and Seb squeezed back, silently vowing that he wouldn't let go, that they would face this storm together, come what may. The weight of the future still hung over them, but in this moment, they were united, as they had always been. They would find a way to stop the storm, to prevent it from destroying everything they held dear. But even as they stood together, side by side, Seb knew that the choices ahead would test them in ways they could never anticipate. The storm was closing in, and it wasn't just a test of strength or resolve. It was a test of sacrifice, of what they were willing to give up to save the ones they loved. The storm would push them to their limits and beyond, and Seb wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But there was one thing he was certain of: he wasn't going to face it alone. They had come this far, together, and they would face whatever came next side by side. In the end, that was all that mattered. As the storm finally began to break, its fury unleashed in full force, Seb held Alaric close, his heart steadfast despite the fear that still lingered in the back of his mind. The winds howled, and the thunder rumbled, but Seb knew that no matter what the storm brought, their love and their bond would carry them through. The future was uncertain, and the storm was only the beginning of what lay ahead. But they were ready to face it, together. And the price of victory would be higher than either of them could have ever imagined. It was a thought that reverberated in Seb's mind as the weight of their struggle pressed heavily upon him. Everything they had fought for, the battles, the sacrifices, the love, had all led to this moment, this final confrontation with the storm that was threatening to destroy everything. Yet, despite their resolve, despite the courage they had shown, there was a gnawing sense of dread in Seb's chest. The prophecy had warned them that the storm would not come without a cost. And now, standing at the edge of the world, the cost was no longer a distant possibility. It was real. It was coming. The winds howled louder, a fierce cry from the very heart of the storm, and Seb could feel it in his bones. The air was thick with tension, charged with the impending destruction. The sky above them had turned a sickly shade of gray, swirling with dark clouds that seemed to churn and pulse like a living creature. The ocean, usually a vast expanse of calm and beauty, was now a raging beast, its waves crashing with terrifying force against the cliffs below. The sea was alive with fury, mirroring the chaos that had consumed Seb's heart. Every gust of wind, every thunderous roar of the ocean, seemed to echo the finality of the choice that lay before them. Alaric stood beside him, his gaze locked on the horizon, where the storm was beginning to take shape. There was no fear in his eyes, only the quiet determination of someone who had accepted the burden of what was to come. Seb knew that Alaric had always understood the cost, had always known that this day would come. But now, seeing the storm rise, seeing the immense power that was gathering, Seb couldn't shake the feeling that the Siren was preparing to face something far worse than he had ever anticipated. It wasn't just the end of a battle. It was the end of everything they had worked for, everything they had fought to protect. The storm's winds began to tear at their clothes, whipping through Seb's hair and stinging his skin. The sea below them whirled and churned, as if the very earth beneath their feet was shaking in fear. The sound of the storm was deafening, a constant roar that drowned out everything else, leaving only the pounding of Seb's heart in his ears. He could feel the power of the ocean rising, an unstoppable force that would sweep away anything in its path. The prophecy had warned them that the storm would come, but it had never mentioned how it would feel, how it would consume them from the inside out, twisting everything they had ever known. Alaric! Seb's voice trembled, his words barely audible over the cacophony of the storm. He reached out, his hand trembling as he sought Alaric's, needing the grounding presence of the Siren. What if we can't stop it? What if? He didn't finish the thought. He couldn't. The storm was no longer just a metaphor. It was here. And it was not something they could control. Not anymore. Alaric's hand found Seb's, and in the storm's chaos, they held on to each other. His touch was steady, unwavering in the face of the storm's fury. We will stop it, Alaric said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the noise like a beacon of hope. We've come too far to turn back now. Whatever the cost, we'll face it together. This is our fight. And we will win. But Seb could see the weight of those words in Alaric's eyes. There was something there, something unspoken, a fear that he had never seen before. It was not the fear of death, it was the fear of loss. The fear that, no matter how hard they fought, no matter how much they sacrificed, there was no guarantee they would emerge from this battle whole. The storm, it seemed, was not just a force of nature. It was a force that tested everything, everything they believed in, everything they loved. The winds grew even stronger, howling like the wails of lost souls, and Seb had to fight to keep his feet on the ground. The ocean's roar intensified, crashing against the cliffs with the force of 1,000 storms. The world around them seemed to be collapsing, the very fabric of reality bending beneath the storm's weight. And in that moment, Seb understood, this was the price of victory. Not just the physical battle, but the emotional toll, the choices they had to make, the things they would have to give up. Victory would not come without sacrifice. It would not come without pain. Seb turned to Alaric, the storm's fury reflected in both of their eyes. The Siren was trembling now, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming weight of the power that was rising around them. The storm was a manifestation of everything they had fought to protect, and yet it was also a reflection of everything they had lost along the way. It was the embodiment of the prophecy, a prophecy that would cost them more than they had ever bargained for. Chapter 32: A Call to Arms. The days following the storm's warning were a blur of urgency. Seb and Alaric worked without pause, moving quickly from one task to the next, each moment weighed down by the gravity of what lay ahead. The prophecy hung over them like a heavy shadow, darkening their every decision, casting doubts on their every move. The storm that had begun to gather strength was not just a natural disaster, it was the embodiment of fate itself, a force that threatened to tear apart both the human world and the siren realm. With no time for rest or reflection, they could only push forward, knowing that the clock was ticking, that the end was drawing near, and that they had to act before everything they had fought for was lost. Seb stood in the war room, a vast and imposing stone chamber that had once been the heart of human strategy. It was here that kings and generals had once gathered to plot the future of their kingdoms. But now it was the place where Seb and his most trusted allies had assembled to make their own plans for survival. The room was a mixture of the past and present, with old maps adorning the walls, their colors faded and edges frayed from years of use, and weapons hanging in racks, their steel dull from neglect. In the midst of all this history, Seb could feel the weight of the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. The walls, once filled with the voices of rulers, now echoed with the tension of a world on the brink of destruction. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation. Each person gathered there had played a part in the fight against the growing storm. Warriors, mages, scholars, and diplomats, all brought together by the common cause of saving their homes from annihilation. But despite their collective experience and wisdom, there was no denying the uncertainty that hung in the air. They were all aware that this was unlike any battle they had ever faced. The prophecy was not something that could be easily fought with swords or magic. It was a force that could only be confronted with sacrifice, and no one knew what the true cost would be. Seb could feel the weight of every gaze on him as he stood at the head of the table, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was quiet, but the silence was heavy with expectation. His allies were waiting for him to give them direction, to tell them what steps to take next. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm, to be the leader they needed him to be in this moment. He had never wanted to lead. He had always been content to follow Alaric, to stand beside him. But now, with the fate of both worlds hanging in the balance, there was no one else who could take charge. "We don't have much time," Seb began, his voice steady, though it carried the unmistakable weight of their dire situation. His words were met with a silence so deep it felt suffocating. The room seemed to grow smaller around him as he spoke, the magnitude of their struggle becoming more apparent with every word. "The prophecy is unfolding, and there are those who would seek to stop it, to keep us from saving both our worlds. We cannot afford to let that happen." His eyes scanned the faces before him, familiar, resolute, yet filled with their own fears. Seb knew they understood what was at stake. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a battle for the future of everything they held dear. Alaric stood by his side, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of uncertainty. His eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered with the weight of their shared burden. Seb could feel the unspoken bond between them, the silent promise that no matter what came, they would face it together. Alaric had never asked for this, never wanted the weight of the prophecy on his shoulders, but now he was as bound to it as Seb was. They were in this together, no matter what sacrifices it would require. And Seb would not let his companion bear the full burden alone, not when their fate was intertwined. "The storm is already rising," Seb continued, his voice growing more urgent. "We can't stop it through conventional means. It's more than just wind and water, it's a force that transcends both worlds. Our only hope is to confront the heart of it, to sever the link that's fueling it. And to do that, we need to take the fight to the source, to those who control it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "There are others who will try to stop us. They'll fight to keep the prophecy from being fulfilled. But we can't let that stop us. We're fighting for both of our worlds, and we can't afford to lose." His words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the task ahead. The people gathered around the table knew what this meant. They had already lost so much, and yet now, they were being asked to risk everything once again. Seb's heart ached for the lives that would be lost, for the sacrifices that would need to be made. But there was no other choice. They had already come too far, and to turn back now would be to allow the storm to destroy everything they loved. A murmured agreement rippled through the room. followed by the sound of footsteps as their allies moved to action. Seb could feel the tension in the air as each person took up their assigned role, ready to do whatever it took to see this through. There was no time for fear, no time for second-guessing. They had a world to save, and that was all that mattered. Seb glanced at Alaric, whose expression remained stoic despite the storm that raged within him. Seb knew that Alaric, too, understood the cost. But together, they would fight until the very end. Whatever the prophecy demanded, they would face it together. He paused, letting the silence settle like mist, his gaze slowly sweeping across the chamber. One by one, his eyes met the faces of those gathered, some hardened by countless battles, others still young and wide-eyed with the weight of responsibility. These were the people who had followed him through every tide and tempest, once drawn by his cunning, his swordsmanship, or the charisma that had made him a captain worth rallying behind. But now, their allegiance ran deeper. No longer bound by titles or duty, they stood with him out of conviction, ready to fight not just for victory, but for the very survival of two intertwined worlds. Among the humans stood figures once considered myth, enemies from whispered tales passed down through generations, sirens. Alaric's people. The very beings Seb had once viewed with suspicion and fear now stood as comrades in arms. Their eyes, luminous with ocean-born light, reflected not hostility, but shared purpose. Scars from ancient conflicts ran down some of their torsos and arms, yet they wore them with pride, not resentment. The room was a picture of unity forged under pressure, a symbol of what could be accomplished when prejudice was cast aside for something greater. Alaric stood beside Seb, his presence as commanding as ever. The silver shimmer of his scales caught the faint torchlight, casting rippling reflections along the walls. He looked like something drawn from a dream or a legend, elegant, otherworldly, but undeniably real. He was no longer just a representative of the sea, no longer just the voice of prophecy. Alaric had become a symbol of the choice they all now faced, to fight for change, or to be drowned by the weight of the past. And beside him, Seb felt the deep resonance of their bond, unshakable and forged through fire and water alike. There was a heaviness in Alaric's eyes, an ache that ran deeper than worry. It was the look of someone who knew too well the cost of sacrifice, who had seen love and hope fray at the edges of war. Still, his voice did not tremble when he finally spoke. "We are facing forces more powerful than anything we've encountered," he said, his tone like the first low rumble of thunder on a still horizon. His words were calm, but they carried the power of a tide, unrelenting, inevitable. He moved forward a step, his gaze turning to the sirens first. "There are those among us, among my own kind, who would rather see the prophecy fail. They cling to the chaos, to their belief that the human world is poison, that it cannot be trusted. They fear what peace would bring, for it would mean surrendering the bitterness they've held onto for generations." There was no accusation in his voice, only truth. It was a wound laid bare, one that had festered in the dark and now needed light to begin healing. Then Alaric turned to the humans. "And there are some of your kind who would rather live blind, clinging to a world that is already crumbling. They fear change as much as they fear us. They see only monsters where there are allies. They would rather let the world drown than admit it needs saving by something it does not understand." His voice dropped slightly, solemn and sorrowful. "But fear is not what will save us. We are stronger together," he continued, and this time his voice rose, firm and clear like a beacon cutting through fog. "Together we have defied the storm before. Together we have learned each other's strengths, shared each other's wounds, and bled on the same battlegrounds. We cannot allow old wounds to fester into new wars, not when the true enemy is already upon us." His words swept through the room like wind stirring a still sea, lifting heads, setting jaws. Seb watched as his crew and the sirens exchanged glances, not of suspicion, but of understanding. A human warrior nodded at a siren with a scar across her cheek. A siren healer placed a hand over the wound of a soldier she'd once feared. It was happening, not through decree or force, but through shared purpose. The tide was shifting. "And we must unite now," Alaric said, stepping back beside Seb, his final words resonating like the crash of a wave. "Because the storm is not waiting. It is coming. And we will meet it, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as one force, bound not by blood, but by choice. The chamber fell silent again, but this time, it was the silence of breath being drawn before a battle cry. The silence before a people chose to rise. A murmur of agreement rippled through the war room, like the hush before a storm breaks across the sea. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Heads nodded, quiet affirmations passed from one fighter to the next, and in the stillness that followed Alaric's words, something began to settle over the gathered resolve. The energy in the chamber shifted, humming with purpose. These were no longer people waiting for orders. They were warriors preparing to shape the future with their own hands. Seb could feel it in his chest, that pulse of collective determination. It was like standing on the deck of a ship just before it collided with the tide, when all that mattered was forward motion. Every heart in the room beat in time with the storm gathering beyond the horizon. The weight of leadership pressed against his shoulders, but it was no longer crushing. Now, it was a shared burden. They weren't just preparing for a battle, they were preparing to make a stand for the very soul of their worlds. He scanned the faces again, eyes locking on the man at the far side of the chamber, Captain Grayson. A towering presence even without his polished armor, Grayson had once been Seb's rival, commanding a powerful fleet loyal to the human kingdom's old regime. There had been a time when they had stood on opposite sides of a battlefield, blades drawn, fire in their blood. But war had a way of revealing truths, and Grayson had proven himself, not just as a warrior, but as a man willing to change. Their gazes met, and the tension of their past flickered briefly in the space between them before Seb stepped forward. He saw the steady calm in Grayson's eyes, the readiness beneath his weathered expression. This was a man who had lived long enough to know that pride was a luxury in times like these. That survival meant letting go of old grudges. "Captain," Seb said, his voice firm, each syllable carrying across the room. All heads turned toward them, the moment suddenly charged with anticipation. The title was deliberate, an acknowledgement of Grayson's authority, and also of the respect Seb now held for him. There was no place for rivalry anymore. Only unity. Grayson straightened, his gloved hands resting calmly on the hilt of his sword. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in challenge, but in expectation. He didn't speak, waiting instead for Seb to finish what they both knew had to be said. The room held its breath. "I need your fleet," Seb said, his voice unwavering. There was no pleading in it, only the certainty of a man asking another to rise to the occasion. "We're going to need every ship, every weapon, and every sailor who's willing to stand with us." The weight of the request hung in the air like a drawn bowstring. Seb knew what he was asking. These weren't just resources, they were lives. Men and women who had survived too many wars, who had fought under flags that no longer held meaning. He wasn't asking them to fight for kings or crowns. He was asking them to fight for something far more fragile and vital: hope. Grayson's jaw tightened slightly. He looked from Seb to Alaric, then to the gathered sirens and humans, the ragtag army that had once been divided by blood and myth. And then he nodded once, solemnly. "You'll have them," he said. "Every last one of us." And with that, the final piece of their alliance fell into place, not with fanfare, but with quiet, resolute commitment. The kind of promise made only by those who knew the storm was coming, and chose to stand anyway. Captain Grayson nodded, the lines on his weathered face deepening with resolve. His voice, rough like gravel underfoot, carried the weight of a lifetime spent fighting against tides both political and literal. "You've got them," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "Every last one of my men and women will fight beside you. We'll hold our lines against anyone who dares to come at us. The storm will break, but we'll weather it together." It wasn't a promise. It was a declaration, spoken like an oath to gods long forgotten. The room seemed to breathe out at once, anchored by his unwavering confidence. Seb felt a wave of gratitude swell inside him. Grayson's support was no small thing. The fleet he commanded wasn't just muscle, it was history, legacy, and fierce loyalty. With those ships and sailors behind them, they had more than just numbers. They had credibility. And in the chaos to come, that might matter more than any weapon. Seb met Grayson's eyes and gave him a small nod, not as a commander, but as an equal. There was no room left for hierarchy, only trust. Standing just beside Grayson, with the fluid poise of a predator waiting to strike, was Lyra. A siren warrior whose name echoed across both coasts and reefs like a whispered warning. In water, she was a blur of death and grace. On land, she carried herself with the same fluid elegance, each movement deliberate and controlled. Her silver scales shimmered in the flickering torchlight, catching glints of fire like stars reflecting off moonlit waves. Her eyes, sharp and sea-colored, flicked to Seb with a kind of curious respect. Once, she might have slit his throat without blinking. Now, she stood ready to protect him. The war had changed everything. The prophecy, even more. "I'll rally the clans," Lyra said, her voice low and melodic, each word curling like smoke in the heavy air. There was music in her tone, but also steel. "The sirens may be divided, but they respect power and honor." Seb turned to her fully, listening with a quiet intensity. The sirens had always been a fractured people, ruled more by instinct than structure, bonded by bloodlines and ancient songs, not by centralized rule. But if Lyra could bring them together, even a fraction of them, the tide of war would shift in their favor. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a symbol. And the clans would follow her, if not out of loyalty, then out of fear. "If we can show them this is their fight too," Lyra continued, "they'll stand with us. We'll break their resistance before they have a chance to strike." Her lips curved in something close to a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. This wasn't a boast, it was a calculated assessment. She knew the stakes, the politics, the fragile egos of the sea folk better than anyone. And she was prepared to wield that knowledge like a weapon. Alaric stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Lyra's arm. It was a silent gesture, one of mutual respect. "You know the reefs better than anyone," he said. "If anyone can unite them, it's you." The bond between the two was strong, perhaps forged in battles past, or through shared scars the sea had carved into them both. Alaric's voice was gentle, but Seb heard the command in it too. It was time. With a sharp nod, Lyra turned and began issuing orders to the other sirens clustered nearby. Her presence shifted the room. Where moments ago tension had ruled, now there was movement, intent. Seb watched her go, struck again by how strange this alliance was, and yet how right it felt. Sirens and humans, once enemies, now building something new. Something worth fighting for. He looked to Alaric, who met his gaze with a silent question, "Are you ready for this?" Seb didn't speak, he just nodded. Ready or not, the storm was coming. And with Grayson's fleets and Lyra's warriors, they finally had a chance to meet it head-on. Alaric's eyes softened, if only briefly, as he looked at Seb, the flicker of tenderness a rare break in the tension that coiled around him like kelp in a current. But the weight of the prophecy pressed heavily on his shoulders, too ancient and too urgent to ignore. "We can't let the opposition win," he said at last, his voice low but unyielding. "The future of both our people is at stake. If they succeed, if they stop the prophecy from coming true, everything is lost." His words fell like stones into still water, sending silent ripples through the room. Seb felt those ripples echo in his chest. Every time he looked at Alaric now, he didn't just see the storm-bound prince of the sea. He saw a man burdened by the fate of two worlds, a man who had chosen alliance over isolation, love over fear. Their bond had grown in the crucible of shared trials, forged stronger with every sacrifice and whispered promise. And now, that connection burned brighter than ever, even under the looming shadow of war. For a moment Seb said nothing. He watched Alaric with quiet intensity, taking in the faint silver sheen of his scales, the stormlight dancing in his sea-glass eyes. This war, this prophecy, it had become so much more than survival. It was about legacy. About what kind of world they wanted to leave behind. About hope, and who had the courage to carry it through the tempest. Seb stepped closer, the air between them charged with something unspoken but deeply felt. "Then we fight," he said at last, his voice steady and resolute. We fight for the future of the human realm. We fight for the sea. And we fight for each other. The last words hung in the air like a vow, anchoring them in something stronger than fate, choice. Alaric's eyes locked with his, the tension in his shoulders easing just a fraction. There was something sacred in the silence that followed, a shared understanding that whatever came next, they would face it together. Not as enemies, not as mere allies, but as something more. Something unbreakable. Around them, the room was already stirring into motion. Plans were forming, orders being relayed, weapons prepared. But at the center of it all stood Seb and Alaric, the heart of this desperate gamble against destiny. They were the fulcrum upon which everything balanced, two lives entwined with the hopes of countless others. Seb's hand brushed Alaric's, barely a touch, but enough to steady them both. There would be no turning back after this. The storm would not wait. And neither would those who sought to stop the prophecy before it reached its end. But Seb had made his choice. His loyalty. His love. His future. All of it was tied to the man before him. Alaric tilted his head, a flicker of a wry smile ghosting across his lips. "You always did have a flair for dramatic speeches," he said, his voice softer now, the storm behind his eyes momentarily calm. But Seb saw the pride there too, the quiet awe in knowing they'd found something worth fighting for amid the chaos. And so, as the final plans took shape and the winds of war stirred outside the war room's heavy stone walls, Seb and Alaric stood united. Two leaders. Two lovers. And soon, two warriors marching into a battle that would decide the fate of everything they knew. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate, letting the silence settle before he spoke. The firelight flickered against the stone walls, casting long shadows behind him as he faced the room filled with allies, warriors, and leaders. Seb's gaze moved steadily across them, one by one, humans and sirens alike, each pair of eyes locking with his, each bearing a different blend of fear, determination, and unspoken questions. He let them feel the weight of the moment before he opened his mouth. "Gather your forces," he said, his voice calm, but edged with steel. It wasn't a request, it was a command. One that carried the full gravity of everything they stood to lose if they failed. His tone was clipped and clear, leaving no room for hesitation or debate. He was not just a captain now. He was the figurehead of something larger than any title, something built on the fragile hope of unity and the fierce urgency of survival. A low murmur rippled through the chamber, boots shifting, hands tightening on hilts, scales rustling softly as the sirens murmured among themselves. The message was clear. This was no longer a plan in theory, no longer something they could push off with talk and caution. It was real, and it was happening at dawn. Captain Grayson gave a tight nod and turned toward his second-in-command, already whispering orders. Lyra was next to move, her lithe form slipping toward the edge of the room as she began mentally tallying which siren clans she could rally fastest. The air thickened with urgency, and the once tense quiet was replaced with purposeful motion, like a war machine slowly whirring to life. Alaric remained at Seb's side, silent but vigilant, his gaze sweeping across the room. His hand hovered near Seb's, as if drawing strength from his presence without the need for words. Though the room bustled now with movement and preparation, there was a stillness between them, a shared center in the eye of the oncoming storm. Seb took one more moment to look over the room as it transformed before his eyes. These people, these warriors from sea and shore, had once stood on opposite sides of a bloody, bitter divide. Now they moved with a shared purpose, a shared urgency. It stirred something deep in him, something that made his chest tighten with both pride and dread. He cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself for one final word. "At first light, we march, not just into battle, but into a new world. What we do tomorrow will echo beyond us, into the tides and the skies. Be ready." His voice dropped with solemn finality, and then he stepped back, letting the swell of activity take over the room. The war room emptied gradually, the crackle of torches and hushed voices giving way to fading footsteps. Soon, only Seb and Alaric remained. The fire burned low now, casting golden-orange light over their faces, etching their expressions with quiet resolve. the moment of calm before the tide turned. Seb looked toward the shuttered window, where just a sliver of moonlight peeked through. Dawn was only hours away. And with it, the storm they had been preparing for their entire lives. The next few days passed in a blur of urgency and unrelenting motion. Every hour was accounted for, every minute spent in preparation. Seb and Alaric became a force of constant movement, commanding, negotiating, reassuring, and planning. Together, they reached out to former rivals, convincing those who had once fought against them to now fight beside them. Old grudges had no place in the shadow of what was coming. What mattered now was unity, and they were building it one alliance at a time, fusing together a fractured world on the edge of collapse. Seb often found himself alongside Captain Grayson at the harbor, standing tall at the helm of the preparations. From dawn until dusk, he oversaw the mobilization of the human fleet. The scent of salt and steel clung to the air as crates of weapons were hauled aboard, sails were checked and mended, and provisions were packed for the long, uncertain days ahead. Sailors moved with a quiet intensity, their footsteps swift but purposeful. Each of them knew the stakes. This wasn't just another skirmish or sea battle. This was the war that would determine whether their homes, families, and very way of life would survive. Grayson stood beside him, arms crossed, his gaze scanning the fleet with a veteran's calm. "They're ready," he said one evening, the sky bruised with sunset. "Maybe not in body, maybe not in heart, but they'll fight. They'll follow you to the end." Seb nodded, feeling the weight of that faith settle heavily on his shoulders. He couldn't afford to falter now. Further down the coast, the sirens gathered in growing numbers. They came from reefs and caverns long forgotten by the surface world, from hidden sanctuaries beneath the waves, drawn by the call to war and the promise of change. The shoreline buzzed with their movement, sleek bodies shimmering under the sun, their song-like voices raised not in music but in readiness. The sea itself seemed to rise to meet them, its waves crashing in a steady rhythm, as if echoing their determination. Lyra stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding. She moved through the gathered sirens like a blade through water, graceful, efficient, relentless. Her voice rang out with clarity, issuing commands and organizing ranks. She turned chaos into cohesion, uniting the often fractured clans with the gravity of her leadership. Her eyes never stopped moving, always watching, always anticipating. Alaric spent his time straddling both worlds. One moment he was beside Seb, reviewing maps and discussing battle plans with the human captains. The next, he was knee-deep in the surf, addressing the sirens in their own tongue, urging them to let go of centuries of mistrust and see this moment for what it was. His presence was magnetic, a living symbol of what this fragile alliance could become. When he spoke, both land and sea listened. At night, the beaches flickered with firelight, as small camps sprang up around the harbor and shore. Soldiers and sirens ate side by side, the boundaries between them blurring with every shared story, every laugh, every nod of mutual respect. Trust, once an impossible dream, was beginning to take root. And through it all, Seb and Alaric remained at the center, guiding, encouraging, reminding everyone what they were fighting for. Even with the camaraderie, there was no mistaking the tension in the air. It pressed in on them like a rising tide, whispering of the coming storm. Scouts brought word of enemy movement. Strange omens were spotted at sea. And still, they prepared. Because they had no other choice. The moment was fast approaching when all their work, all their sacrifices, would be tested. On the eve before departure, Seb stood alone at the edge of the harbor, staring out at the darkened water. The moon floated above the horizon like a silent witness, its reflection broken by the waves. Behind him, the world was finally ready. Ahead, only the unknown waited. But beside him, as always, came Alaric, silent, steady, and unshakable. Together, they looked toward the horizon, knowing that the dawn would bring with it the battle for everything. The night before they were to set sail, Seb stood alone at the edge of the cliffs that overlooked the restless sea. The wind howled around him, cold and sharp, tugging at his coat and stinging his skin like needles. Below, the ocean seethed, dark, thunderous, alive with a fury that had yet to break the surface. It wasn't just a storm. It was something deeper, older, as if the world was preparing to purge itself of all that had come before. Seb stared into the abyss, his jaw tight, his thoughts heavier than the clouds rolling in. The sky above was painted in deep, bruised hues, purples and blacks smeared across a canvas of stars that seemed dimmer than usual. The scent of rain and salt hung in the air, thick and electric. It was the kind of night that felt like a warning, a final breath before the plunge. Every instinct inside Seb told him that this was the point of no return. Tomorrow, they would either change the fate of two worlds or watch them fall apart. Alaric appeared beside him without a word, his footsteps silent even against the crunch of gravel and wind. He moved like the sea itself, fluid, strong, and ageless. His silver scales shimmered faintly beneath his cloak, catching what little light remained. Seb didn't need to turn to know who it was. He felt the quiet steadiness of Alaric's presence, like an anchor dropped deep into his soul. Together, they stood on the edge, staring into the vast unknown, the roar of the sea below echoing the storm inside them both. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was grounding, full of unspoken truths. It was the silence of two people who had already said the most important things with actions rather than words. But eventually, as the wind surged and the sea growled, Alaric turned towards Seb, his voice barely audible over the rising storm. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Alaric said softly, "I'm glad you're with me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had endured, every fight, every moment of doubt, every sacrifice. It was a declaration of trust, of solidarity, of a bond that had been forged not just by fate but by choice. Seb turned to look at him then, his eyes searching Alaric's face. There was no hesitation in the siren's expression, only a quiet strength and something tender in the way his eyes lingered. In that moment, all the chaos fell away. The future, the prophecy, the war, it all faded beneath the truth that shimmered between them. Seb reached out, his hand brushing Alaric's, grounding them both in the present. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else," Seb replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "No matter what's waiting for us out there, I'll face it with you." His fingers curled around Alaric's, a firm grasp in the face of uncertainty. It was a promise not just of alliance, but of love, of shared purpose and unwavering devotion. Whatever storm was coming, they would stand against it together. They stood there for a while longer, side by side, watching the sea roil and crash against the cliffs. The wind whipped around them like a living thing, and lightning flickered faintly on the horizon. It was as though the world held its breath, waiting for the first move. And still, Seb and Alaric stood firm, drawing strength from one another in that final, fragile moment of peace. As the night deepened, the wind grew colder, more restless, and the waves began to rise. The first droplets of rain fell like whispered warnings against their skin. And when they finally turned away from the cliff's edge, walking back toward the waiting camp, neither of them looked back. There was no need. The storm would find them soon enough. Seb turned to Alaric, the storm-lit sky casting a pale silver light across his features. His heart swelled, not with fear, but with something fiercer, steadier. Love. Resolve. A quiet certainty that no matter how dark the road ahead became, they would not walk it alone. His gaze held Alaric's, unflinching, and he spoke the words he felt in his bones. "We've always been in this together," he said, voice low but firm. "And we always will be." For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. The wind curled around them like a living thing, carrying the scent of rain and sea, and the distant crash of waves echoed the thunder in Seb's chest. Alaric's eyes, the deep color of the ocean under moonlight, shimmered with something vulnerable and powerful all at once. He didn't reply right away. He didn't need to. In that shared silence, something deeper passed between them than words could ever hold. That look between them was a promise. It carried the weight of everything they had survived, betrayals, losses, choices made in the dark, and everything they were still willing to risk. It was a vow forged not in temples or rituals, but in moments like this, where truth stood bared and unshaken by the chaos beyond. Alaric gave the faintest of nods, a gesture that felt like a binding oath, as if the sea itself recognized the gravity of it. Tomorrow would bring the unknown, wrapped in the prophecy's shadow. Whether it ended in salvation or ruin, none of them could say. But Seb knew, with a rare clarity, that the path forward wasn't just his or Alaric's alone. It belonged to them both, woven into the threads of fate and defiance, of love and war. Whatever destiny demanded, they would not bend without a fight. The winds picked up, rustling the edges of Seb's coat and tossing Alaric's silver-streaked hair across his brow. Yet neither moved, as if standing together in that moment was their quiet rebellion against the forces set in motion. The storm, still a dark silhouette in the distance, loomed larger now. Its presence was no longer a warning, it was a certainty, a truth barreling toward them with relentless force. Seb's thoughts flickered to the people counting on them. Grayson and his fleet, Lyra and the Siren warriors, every soul who had chosen to defy the old divides for a sliver of hope. Their fates hung in the balance too. And it was that knowledge, that responsibility, which hardened Seb's resolve like steel tempered by flame. He looked back at Alaric one last time before they stepped away from the cliff's edge. In the depth of those eyes, he saw all the memories they had made, and all the future they still dared to reach for. He didn't need to say anything else. Everything that mattered had already been spoken, had already been understood. They turned as one, walking into the wind, back toward the heart of their camp. Torches flickered in the darkness ahead, casting long shadows on the stone and sand. Every step they took was a march toward the storm, toward the prophecy, toward the reckoning that would either break them or remake the world entirely. And whatever came next, whatever trials, sacrifices, or triumphs, Seb knew only one thing for certain. They would face it together. Always. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the harbor came alive with movement. Masts creaked and sails unfurled, catching the wind as the fleet prepared to depart. The sky was streaked with gold and gray, the colors of warning and hope entwined. Sirens moved among the crews with practiced grace, their presence a powerful reminder of the alliance forged not by convenience, but by conviction. Humans and sirens stood shoulder to shoulder on the decks, each one aware that this journey was unlike any before. It would lead them straight into the heart of the storm that had been written in prophecy. Seb stood at the prow of the lead ship, his coat whipping around him as the wind picked up speed. His eyes swept the fleet behind him, rows of ships cutting through the waters with a silent urgency. He could feel the weight of leadership pressing down on him, but he bore it willingly. This was more than war. It was the culmination of everything they had fought for, the moment where courage would be tested and bonds would be either shattered or solidified. Beside him, Alaric emerged from the lower deck, his silver scales catching the light like liquid metal. He said nothing, only met Seb's gaze with a quiet nod that spoke volumes. The storm ahead loomed like a living thing, its clouds spiraling in the distance, its thunder already rumbling in Seb's bones. But Alaric's presence, unwavering and fierce, was the anchor Seb needed. They had made it this far together, and they would face the final battle side by side. The ocean itself seemed to sense what was coming. The waves surged around the ships, frothing with energy that felt neither wholly natural nor entirely magical. Beneath the surface, Seb knew, sirens swam in formation, their sleek forms barely visible but unmistakably present. Above, gulls shrieked and wheeled in agitated flocks, disturbed by the unnatural stillness that crept in just before a storm's fury. On the decks, warriors checked their weapons, adjusted armor, murmured last-minute prayers, and cast glances toward the sky. Some carried tokens from loved ones tucked close to their hearts. Others bore scars from battles past, reminders of what they had endured to get here. Each soul aboard those ships carried a piece of the world they were trying to save, and together they formed a force bound by more than duty. They were bound by hope. Lyra stood at the helm of one of the siren ships, her sharp eyes never leaving the dark horizon. Her warriors flanked her, their expressions carved from stone. Though they had once been divided by blood and history, the sight of human ships sailing alongside theirs spoke of a new future. If they could survive this storm, it would be a future forged in unity. As they drew closer to the storm's edge, the winds howled louder, and the skies darkened to a bruised blue. Rain began to fall in thin, stinging sheets, and lightning flickered within the clouds like the beat of a warning heart. Yet no one turned back. No one hesitated. The time for second-guessing was long past. What waited within the storm would challenge everything they knew, but they would meet it head-on. Seb gripped the railing as the ship plunged forward, the spray of seawater cold on his face. He could see the wall of clouds ahead now, a swirling gate to the unknown. Behind him, the fleet followed with unwavering resolve. They were more than soldiers. They were symbols of defiance, of love, of sacrifice. And they would not let their worlds fall without a fight. The storm of destiny loomed like a great maw, ready to devour all in its path. But as the fleet surged into its heart, Seb and Alaric stood unyielding, their hearts beating in sync with the drums of war. Let the storm come. Let it rage. They were ready, and they would not break. Chapter 33 The Battle Begins. The roar of the ocean became an all-consuming symphony of chaos as the fleet surged deeper into the storm's wrath. Waves rose like walls, slamming against the hulls of the ships, sending sheets of seawater crashing over the decks. Lightning forked across the sky in jagged flashes, illuminating the darkness in bursts of blinding white. The thunder followed close behind, a guttural growl that shook the very bones of the ships. And yet, amidst the fury, Seb remained rooted at the prow, his eyes locked on the swirling void ahead, where clouds twisted like the coils of some great sea serpent. The storm wasn't just weather, it was a force of fate. Rain battered down like arrows from the heavens, soaking every surface, turning the decks slick and treacherous. The crew moved with practiced urgency, voices lost to the wind as they secured lines, adjusted sails, and held their course. Every creak of wood and every howl of wind was a reminder that nature itself was their adversary, and yet also their proving ground. This storm wasn't just a test of strength. It was a crucible, one that would burn away doubt and fear until only the truest parts of them remained. Alaric's presence beside Seb was a steady flame in the tempest. His silver scales shimmered with each flash of lightning, casting ghostly reflections across the deck. His hair clung to his skin, his face etched with a warrior's focus. The Siren Prince was a creature of the sea, but even he was not immune to the storm's fury. Still, he did not flinch, did not waver. He had faced storms before, but never one burdened with prophecy, never one that carried the fate of two worlds in its heart. "Ready yourself," Seb said, his voice barely audible over the storm's scream, but Alaric heard it. The words were not just a warning, they were a vow. A signal that the time for doubt was over. Seb's grip on the rail tightened, the cold iron grounding him as his mind braced for what was to come. Lightning arced again, reflecting in his eyes like fire. "We face it together," Alaric replied, his tone resolute. But there was a subtle tension beneath it, the unspoken knowledge that together might not mean forever. Not in this battle. Not when sacrifice lingered so close at hand. Yet in that moment, their bond, tempered in trust, sealed in love, held fast. Whatever the storm demanded, they would meet it united. The other ships followed in formation, their sails taut and creaking, their prows slicing through the waves like blades. On board, sirens and humans stood side by side, weapons in hand, eyes forward. The alliance that had once seemed impossible was now the foundation of their strength. Warriors from two worlds, prepared to bleed for the same cause. For peace. For the prophecy. For one another. Seb glanced over his shoulder and caught a glimpse of Captain Grayson shouting orders, his coat soaked, his hat long gone to the wind. Behind him, Lyra stood at the bow of her ship, her eyes narrowed, her voice lost in the storm as she rallied her sirens. These were no longer former enemies. They were comrades, brothers and sisters in arms. The fleet was not just an army. It was a living declaration that unity could rise even from centuries of mistrust. With a deafening crack, a bolt of lightning struck the sea nearby, sending a geyser of water into the sky. The ships rocked violently, but held formation. The heart of the storm was near now. Seb could feel it, a center of stillness wrapped in violence, a place where the veil between worlds would thin and the truth of the prophecy would be laid bare. His pulse thundered in his ears, not from fear, but from readiness. This was the moment. They sailed forward into the mouth of destiny, wind and water clawing at them, but their resolve was unshakable. Whatever horrors awaited them, whatever sacrifices would be demanded, they would not falter. The storm might roar. The sea might rise. But they would rise higher. Together. A sharp, haunting cry cut through the howling wind, seizing Seb's attention. His head snapped to the side, his eyes immediately locking onto Lyra, the siren warrior, standing at the bow of a nearby ship. Her silver scales gleamed like moonlight, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm. Her sharp, angular features were set in a grim expression, her body poised with the grace of a predator. Without a moment's hesitation, she pointed toward the horizon, and Seb's heart skipped a beat as he followed her gesture. There, emerging from the thick mist like phantoms, were the outlines of the enemy fleet, a dark, menacing line of ships cutting through the ocean with cold precision. They were coming. Seb's stomach twisted into knots as the realization hit him. The enemy fleet was here, closer than he'd ever imagined, their sails like dark flags of doom. The sight of them was both a shock and an inevitability, a harbinger of the battle to come. Their ships moved with a deadly purpose, each one gliding smoothly through the water, as if they had been waiting for this moment, biding their time in the storm. Seb could feel the weight of their arrival in the pit of his stomach, the tension in the air thickening with the pulse of impending violence. "They're here." Lyra's voice cut through the wind, her tone steady and commanding despite the fearsome circumstances. "We've been spotted. The battle begins." Her words were simple, but they rang out like a call to arms, their finality leaving no room for doubt. There was no turning back now. The fight was upon them. Seb felt his muscles tense in response, his grip tightening around the cold metal of the ship's rail. Time seemed to slow as his mind raced, his body instinctively preparing for the inevitable clash. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline starting to surge through his veins. The enemy fleet had arrived, just as they'd expected, but the reality of it was far more visceral than any battle plan or strategy could have prepared him for. The black sails of the enemy's ships seemed to absorb the storm's fury, their dark shapes stark against the roiling sea. The flags that flew from the masts were ominous, the symbols of those who would see the prophecy crushed beneath their heels. Seb's rage flared, a fire that burned hot and fierce. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the future of both their worlds. His thoughts raced as the sight of the enemy fleet filled him with a burning determination. They were here to stop the prophecy from coming true, to undo everything they had fought for, to keep the sirens and humans divided. They wanted to see the worlds remain at war, locked in their hatred and distrust. Seb clenched his jaw, the weight of the moment sinking into his bones. But he would not let that happen. Not after all they had sacrificed. Not after everything that had brought them to this point. "We sail into battle now," Seb said, his voice low but filled with an unshakable resolve. His words weren't just for Alaric. They were a rallying cry to the entire fleet, to all those who stood by him. His eyes locked with Alaric's, the Siren Prince standing at his side, the weight of the moment heavy between them. "We protect the prophecy, and we protect each other. No matter what." There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. The storm was not just outside, it was inside them, too, swirling with determination and fury. Alaric's gaze hardened as Seb spoke, his jaw set and his hands clenched at his sides. The prince's silver scales shimmered in the dying light of the storm, the gleam of his body reflecting the gravity of their situation. There was no turning back now. The battle would test every ounce of strength, every ounce of willpower. But as Seb looked at him, he saw not just a warrior, he saw a partner, a companion who shared in this fight, who would stand by him through the storm, no matter how fierce. The wind howled louder, and the first ripples of battle seemed to ripple across the water, as if the ocean itself was responding to the tension. Seb turned his gaze back to the enemy fleet, now looming larger on the horizon. The world seemed to shrink, the sea narrowing into a path that led only one way forward. There was no more planning, no more preparation. There was only the moment that lay before them, the choice to face the storm or be consumed by it. As the enemy's ships came into view, The air thickened with anticipation, the first flashes of battle lighting up the horizon. The war they had prepared for was no longer a distant fear. It was here, it was real. The prophecy was about to unfold, and no matter the outcome, Seb knew one thing with certainty: they would face this storm together. He gripped the rail tightly, his eyes fixed on the fleet ahead, every muscle in his body alive with purpose. This was the fight that would decide everything. Alaric's eyes met Seb's across the chaos, the unspoken bond between them stronger than ever. In that brief moment, as the storm of battle raged around them, the weight of everything they had fought for was clear. The prophecy, their worlds, the future, all of it was on the line. No matter what, Alaric echoed, his voice firm and resolute, a promise that carried the depth of their shared commitment. Seb nodded in response, feeling the intensity of their connection surge through him. The battle was here, but they would face it together, as they always had. The battle erupted in a deafening roar, the sound of cannons blasting and sirens shrieking in fury. The sky seemed to crack with the violence of it all, the wind carrying the clash of steel and the battle cries of warriors. The air was thick with tension, every breath heavy with the weight of the struggle. Seb's pulse quickened, and with a swift motion, he drew his sword, the familiar weight of it grounding him in the moment. The metal felt like an extension of his own body, and with a deep breath, he ran toward the edge of the ship. The sea had become a battlefield, its surface churning violently beneath the ships, each wave a reminder of the chaos unfolding. The water itself seemed to come alive, as if the very ocean was waging war alongside them. At the front of their fleet, Captain Grayson's ship surged through the waves with terrifying speed, its hull cutting through the water like a blade. Seb could see the men aboard, soldiers who had once been his adversaries, now fighting alongside him, their faces set in grim determination. They moved as one, a unified force with a single purpose. The sirens, too, fought with a deadly grace. Their sleek, powerful forms slithered through the water with unmatched speed, their movements a blur of silver as they tore through the enemy ranks. The ferocity of their assault was like nothing Seb had ever witnessed, each strike precise and deadly, a testament to the years of training and the deep-seated need for survival. Seb barely had time to adjust as the first enemy ship closed in on theirs. With a sudden rush of movement, the first clash came. His sword met an enemy blade with a sharp, metallic ring that echoed across the ship. The force of the impact jolted through his arm, but there was no time to savor the strike. A moment later, another enemy came at him, and he was forced to block with a swift, practiced motion. The battle had descended into a whirlwind of weapons, magic, and raw power, and Seb had to focus every ounce of his energy on surviving. Each moment was a blur, each movement was life or death. The air was thick with the acrid scent of salt water mixed with smoke from the cannons, the acrid tang of battle rising to meet him. Seb's mind raced, shifting between instincts and strategy, scanning the battlefield for threats as his body reacted without hesitation. His grip tightened on the hilt of his sword, the familiar weight of it grounding him even as chaos surged around him. His eyes flicked to Alaric, who fought at his side, cutting down enemies with the same lethal grace that had earned him his place as a prince. They were a team, each move they made, every strike, a silent conversation, a shared rhythm forged in years of hardship. The clash of metal, the screams of the wounded, the roar of magic, each moment seemed to stretch into eternity. But Seb's mind remained focused, sharp, driven by the knowledge that every action had consequences. He couldn't afford to falter. He couldn't afford to hesitate. The enemy was relentless, coming at them from all sides, but Seb held firm, his movements precise and deadly. His sword became an extension of his will, a tool for survival, for victory. Each time he parried a blow or struck down an enemy, he felt a surge of adrenaline, a rush that pushed him forward, deeper into the heart of the battle. Around him, the sounds of battle reached a deafening crescendo. The ships rocked with the impact of cannon fire, splinters flying through the air as their hulls were battered. The sky above was thick with dark clouds, as if nature itself had joined the fray, adding its fury to the war below. Seb could feel the storm in his bones, a primal force that called to him. The sea, the wind, the lightning, it all seemed to be part of the same struggle. and he, too, was a part of it. This was his fight. This was their fight. Amidst the chaos, Seb's focus never wavered. He fought not just for himself, not just for Alaric, but for the future they had dreamed of, one where siren and human could coexist, where the prophecy would not be stopped. His strikes were swift and sure, each one carrying the weight of his resolve. But the battle was far from easy. For every enemy he took down, two more seemed to take their place. They were fierce, relentless, and they fought with the same desperation that Seb felt in his own chest. As the battle raged on, Seb could feel the tide of the conflict shift. The first wave of enemy ships had been pushed back, but there were more, always more. The sirens and humans, though united in purpose, fought a battle against impossible odds. But Seb knew they couldn't stop now. There was no retreat, no surrender. The prophecy demanded action, and he was determined to see it fulfilled. His eyes flicked back to Alaric, who fought like a force of nature, his silver scales gleaming with every strike, a beacon of strength and defiance. They were in this together, no matter what. From the corner of his eye, Seb saw Alaric leap into the fray with the ferocity of a predator, his body twisting and turning with an effortless grace that only a siren could possess. Alaric was a blur of motion, his silver scales catching the fleeting light of the storm-stricken sky as he moved. Each swing of his blade was swift, decisive, cutting down enemy soldiers with a precision that left no room for doubt. The Siren Prince was a force to be reckoned with. His movements were a dance of destruction, and Seb couldn't help but feel his heart swell with pride. Alaric wasn't just fighting for the prophecy. They were fighting for a future together, a future that no one, not even the storm or their enemies, could take away from them. Seb's resolve hardened at the sight of his lover, his partner, moving with such deadly grace. They were in this together. But the battle was far from over. Seb's attention was constantly pulled in different directions, his focus snapping between the chaos of the battlefield and the growing storm that loomed over them. The storm was more than just a violent weather phenomenon. It was the very manifestation of the prophecy itself, a physical embodiment of the world's resistance to change. It howled and churned above them, dark and ominous, as if the sky itself was warning them, threatening to swallow them whole. The storm seemed to pulse with an ancient energy, one that had been waiting for this moment, the final confrontation. And the enemy, Seb knew, understood what was at stake. If they could stop the prophecy, they could destroy everything he and Alaric had fought for, their worlds, their union, the future they had dreamed of. As the enemy pressed in, their ships blocking out the horizon, Seb's mind flickered back to the task at hand. He couldn't afford to be distracted by the storm, no matter how much it seemed to demand his attention. The battle was all-consuming, every moment one of survival. The roar of cannons filled the air, the shriek of steel clashing with steel echoed across the water, and the scent of salt and smoke mixed with the acrid tang of blood. He could hear the shouts of his crew, their voices strained with effort, but there was a unity in their cries. The human fleet, despite being outnumbered, fought with a tenacity born of necessity. They had no choice but to succeed. The storm, the prophecy, the enemy, it was all connected, and they were the only ones who could change the course of history. "Keep fighting!" Seb shouted over the cacophony of battle, his voice carrying through the chaos, a beacon of defiance. "We cannot let them win!" His words rang with the power of someone who understood what was at stake. They were not just fighting for their survival. They were fighting for a new future, one that could unite the human and siren worlds. His command pushed the crew forward, each of them driven by the same urgency, the same understanding of the stakes. Seb could see the men and women of his fleet rallying, their resolve hardening as the enemy pressed them. They knew that the fight wasn't just for their lives. It was for everything they had ever known or hoped for. Each cannon blast, each strike of steel, and each swing of a sword brought them closer to the tipping point. The battle was a blur of violence and desperation, each side fighting with everything they had. But even amidst the chaos, Seb's mind stayed sharp. He could see the movements of his crew, hear the rhythm of their actions as they fought as one unit. The sirens were relentless, their bodies slicing through the water with unnatural speed, while the humans held their own, their courage and resolve unshakable. Every strike was a testament to their collective will, each one inching them closer to the victory that was no longer just a possibility, it was a necessity. The weight of the prophecy loomed over him, its presence a constant pressure on his chest. He could feel it in the air, the charge of destiny that electrified the space between every breath. If they failed, if the prophecy was thwarted now, the consequences would be unimaginable. Seb had always known that the path ahead was fraught with danger, but standing in the midst of this chaos, the storm above them and the enemy at their backs, the full gravity of it all hit him like a wave crashing against a cliff. They had no choice but to win. There was no other option. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of battle, but Seb barely noticed. His focus remained on the here and now, the fight before him, the crew he was leading, and the future that was still in their hands. Every time he parried an enemy blade or struck down another soldier, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself or Alaric. He was fighting for everyone aboard this ship, for the future of two worlds, for the unity that had been denied for so long. And every strike was a promise to those who had fought beside him that he would not let them down. Beside him, he could see Grayson, his old adversary turned ally, leading the human fleet with the same fierce resolve that had made him a respected captain. His ship cut through the water with the strength of a battle-hardened veteran, and his crew fought with a focused determination that matched Seb's own. The Sirens, too, were a force to be reckoned with, their lethal grace overwhelming the enemy. Each movement was fluid, deadly, and precise. They had become a force of nature, one that would not be stopped. Seb's thoughts flashed back to Alaric once more, the Siren Prince whose very presence had become a source of strength. He fought like a storm, his every movement filled with the kind of power that only someone bound to the sea could possess. Seb knew that Alaric wasn't just fighting for the prophecy, he was fighting for the two of them, for a life beyond this battle, for a future where the siren and human worlds could coexist. Seb's heart clenched as he watched his lover, his partner, cut down another enemy with ruthless efficiency. They were fighting not just for survival, but for each other, for the life they had yet to build. And Seb would not let anything destroy that future. Just as Seb thought they might have the upper hand, the sea itself seemed to rebel against them. The wind howled louder, the water thrashing with an almost sentient fury. Without warning, a massive wave rose from the depths, towering like a mountain, taller than any of the ships in their fleet. The wave crested with such overwhelming force that the very air seemed to vibrate with its power. The fleet scattered in panic, but the wave's might was too much to overcome. Ships splintered and buckled under its force, men and sirens alike thrown into the churning sea. Seb gritted his teeth, his hands desperately clutching the railing as the ship rocked violently, threatening to break apart. He barely managed to keep his footing, his muscles straining against the force of the water, but the scene unfolding around him felt like a nightmare. In the chaos, his heart stopped. Through the tumult, he spotted Alaric, his silver scales glowing in the flash of lightning above, as the waves swept him off the deck. The sight of the Siren Prince's body being hurled into the water sent a jolt of panic through Seb, a cold fist clenching around his chest. Time seemed to slow as Seb's breath caught in his throat. There was no hesitation, no second thought. He didn't care about the battle anymore. He didn't care about the storm that was still raging around them. The only thing that mattered in that moment was Alaric, and the desperate need to pull him back from the abyss. "Alaric!" Seb cried, his voice lost to the storm but his heart pounding with fear. He watched as Alaric struggled to stay afloat, his limbs moving against the violent tide, his sharp eyes scanning the dark water as the waves crashed over him. Seb's pulse raced, his body reacting without thought, without reason. Without thinking, he dove into the water, the cold shock of it slamming into him as the ocean threatened to pull him under. Every stroke felt like a battle against the waves, his arms burning, his chest tight, but he pushed on. Alaric needed him. He couldn't lose him. The sea was relentless, each wave crashing over him, the current pulling him in every direction. The battle seemed distant now, a world away, as Seb's entire focus narrowed to one singular goal, Alaric. His eyes barely scanned the churning water as he searched for his lover. and then there he was, his form illuminated by a flash of lightning above. Seb's heart leaped as he reached out, grabbing onto Alaric's arm with a force that could have crushed bone. The storm raged around them, but Seb could feel the steady beat of Alaric's heart, frantic and fast against his chest. His own pulse quickened, but it was the warmth of Alaric's skin, the solid presence of him in the water, that gave him the strength to continue. Alaric's eyes were wide, his lips moving, but Seb couldn't hear him over the deafening howl of the wind and the crash of the waves. Seb couldn't make out the words, but the urgency was clear in the prince's gaze. He was struggling, disoriented by the storm and the sudden violence of the waves, but his body was still strong, still fighting. Seb pulled him closer, pressing him to his chest as the two of them were tossed around by the storm's fury. The water roiled around them, a relentless force that seemed determined to tear them apart, but Seb held fast. His arms were a vice around Alaric, his breath shallow but steady, his thoughts consumed by the need to keep the prince safe. The storm, the battle, the world seemed to be closing in on them, but Seb's focus remained on Alaric. It was as if the rest of the world had faded into the background. The fleet was still fighting, the sound of cannons and the clash of swords echoing in the distance, but all Seb could hear was the roar of the storm and the frantic thudding of his own heart. His hands trembled as they gripped Alaric, his body shaking with cold and exhaustion, but he would not let go. Not now. Not ever. They had fought too hard, too long for this. They had sacrificed everything for the chance to be together, and he wasn't going to lose him now, not when they were so close. The waves continued to crash around them, dragging at their bodies, trying to separate them, but Seb clung to Alaric with all his strength. It wasn't just about survival now. It was about the bond they shared, the promise they had made to each other. The prophecy, the storm, the battle, all of it felt distant now, as if the very universe was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. But Seb knew, in the depths of his soul, that no matter what happened, they would face it together. They had always been together, had always fought side by side, and that would not change. As they were tossed again by the unforgiving tide, Seb could feel the exhaustion starting to take its toll. His body ached, his limbs heavy, but he refused to slow down. Alaric needed him. The storm needed to be weathered, the battle needed to be won, and Seb would not falter. The storm may have risen in defiance, the world may have tried to tear them apart, but Seb and Alaric, together, were stronger than the storm. Stronger than the enemies surrounding them. Stronger than the weight of the prophecy itself. The water surged beneath them again, a new wave threatening to drown them both, but Seb held on, never once letting go of Alaric. The Siren Prince's breaths were shallow, his movements slower now as the storm began to take its toll on him too. Seb could feel his heart breaking as he held Alaric closer, whispering words of encouragement that were swallowed by the wind. But no matter what, he wouldn't give up. They would survive this. They would fight together, and they would emerge from this battle victorious, their fates no longer in the hands of the storm, but in their own. Through the chaos and the violence of the storm, Seb's resolve hardened. They had come so far, and he would not let it all be destroyed in this final moment. He had already lost so much, he would not lose Alaric too. As the storm raged on, Seb clung to his love, his future, and the promise that no matter what happened next, they would face it together, just as they had faced every trial before. In the midst of the chaos, in the heart of the storm and the battle that seemed to stretch on forever, that was the only certainty they had left. Everything else had become a blur, uncertain, unpredictable, and constantly shifting like the sea around them. The prophecy, once clear and firm, now seemed like nothing more than a distant whisper amidst the sound of crashing waves and the cries of battle. The future felt as fragile as the ships fighting to stay afloat, tossed about by forces beyond their control. But there, in the silence between the waves, there was one thing Seb could hold on to with all his heart: they were together. As the storm raged around them, the uncertainty of the world had never been more apparent. Ships were sinking, men and sirens were falling, and even the ocean itself seemed to turn against them. The skies were torn apart by lightning, the air thick with the stench of salt and smoke. There was nothing certain about the fate of the battle, no guarantee of survival, no assurance that they would emerge from the chaos victorious. Yet, despite it all, Seb knew this: he and Alaric had each other. And in that moment, when everything else was uncertain, that was the one truth he could cling to. In the midst of the violence, Seb's grip on Alaric never wavered. The waves crashed around them, threatening to tear them apart, but Seb held on to him, his fingers tightening with each moment they were tossed around by the relentless tide. No matter what the storm brought, no matter how the world shifted, he would never let go. The idea of facing the future without Alaric by his side was too much to bear. So he held on, not just to his lover, but to the belief that as long as they fought together, they could survive whatever came their way. They had faced so much together: loss, betrayal, the forces of fate itself, and yet, through it all, they had always found a way to endure. Even now, as the ocean seemed to swallow everything around them, Seb could feel that unspoken bond between them, stronger than any storm, deeper than any prophecy. There was no turning back, no running from the consequences of their actions. But there was also no uncertainty in the fact that they would face it all together. That, for better or worse, was the one certainty that no force in the world could take from them. And so, despite the overwhelming odds, despite the storm, Seb held on to Alaric, knowing that they would face whatever came next side by side. That certainty, that shared strength, was the only thing left standing amidst the wreckage of their world. The future might be unknown, the path ahead unclear, but they would walk it together, and that was enough. In the face of everything, it was the only truth they needed.